Welcome to Thwarting Insider Threats with Racktop. I'm Jonathan Halstich, the CTO and co-founder of Racktop Systems. Prior to founding Racktop, I spent 15 years as an employee at the Department of Defense, and I've been working with the intelligence community for over 20 years, where I've been involved with both offensive and defensive cyber operations and have intimate knowledge of detecting and responding to insider threats. So I wanted to give you some statistics about commercial threats in North America. And so I think that these mirror the government threats, but obviously against the government, there's even more espionage and probably more insider threats. But 30% of attacks involved internal actors or insider threats in the 2020 study that Verizon did. And 55% of all the attacks were financially motivated. And in this study, they actually thought that either there was a decline in cyber espionage or it was underreported. But that study was done prior to the publication of the SolarWinds incident, which I think goes and shows you how vast and expansive our foreign adversaries are going against our national secrets. So that was an attack that went against both commercial corporations as well as the government. And you can see it has a vast impact. And so I think cyber espionage will be on the rise for a very long time to come. And so what do insider threats look like? There's two types. There's the turncloak, which is someone that actively and knowingly is trying to harm the organization. And then there's the unwitting pawn that is acting from the inside in a way that is harming the organization, but they might not realize their actions have a negative consequence. And so turncloaks often develop because they have ideological differences. Maybe they join the organization and agree with it, but their ideologies change, or they join the organization with the purpose of stealing information from the inside. They may also have felt wrong. Maybe they were passed over for promotion, didn't like how they were treated in a meeting. Or maybe their situation has changed and they're not getting paid enough and they have a gambling debt or a problem and they have financial pressures and they see that as the only way out. They may also be blackmailed or exploited or actively recruited, especially when you think about foreign adversaries going after secrets. They may actively recruit through a foreign intelligence service different employees at an organization. And then the pawn, typically, they might even be convinced to do something trivial, like just share information about the products that are used, the security tools, just how does the environment look, how does the building, how does the network look. They might not realize that they're participating in something that's leading to something bigger. Or they clicked on an email that downloaded a payload that gave the adversary a persistent backdoor. There's many ways that the pawn can be tricked and sometimes exploited by their loneliness. Maybe they're lonely and they get involved with a relationship. They don't realize that the relationship with the other person is just there to gain access and information and using their loneliness to get that information. Or sometimes, another insider threat, another employee or peer leverages them. Maybe they leverage their access. They get them to believe they're helping them and doing something right to help them. It's not negative against the company, sharing passwords, sharing the account. The person can't get their job done. They really want to get the job done for the boss. Hey, can you do this for me? They do something that in the end has a negative consequence for the organization and the company by sharing or helping their colleague in that way. And typically what we see are three types of outcomes. There's the leak, which is the intentional exposure of data. So somebody takes documents and shares it with the press, or maybe they take documents and give it to an adversary or competing company. Or there's the unintentional compromise of data. Somebody accidentally forwards an email with sensitive data that they shouldn't have. Somebody accidentally puts data on a share that has too much exposure and it had classified data and unclassified share, or it was super sensitive data that shouldn't have gotten out there or wasn't ready to be released and it was put out early. And then you have the sabotage of systems. Maybe somebody deletes data intentionally. They make data unavailable or cut the network, all sorts of things that destroy or manipulate data. And there's plenty of famous insider threat stories. Obviously, the most popular and famous one in recent history in terms of government secrets is the Edward Snowden incident, where he stole troves of information and publicized it to both the press and everybody to see. So that had grave damage. But then there's also, lots that have been in the news There's a Tesla incident where somebody took trade secrets. There's a Google incident where somebody took self-driving car secrets to create their own company and then sold that information. So, and then earlier this year, there was one in higher education and research where somebody, a Chinese student, had access to a bunch of research data. They took that data and they actually were detained at the airport on their way leaving the country. But the reason they had access to that data is they had poor controls, and they couldn't even prosecute the person because they were granted access to the data and they didn't have controls and audit to see what was going on, even though the professor said they illegally and inappropriately took that data. And of course, there's all the ones that got away, the ones we'll never hear about, people that stole data and were never caught. And I would bet that's probably the majority of what happens with insider threats, even down to, and things that people don't think about too much in, commercial organizations. The sales guy takes the lead list or all the sales contact information and then brings it to their new company. It still has damage and can have an effect on the company. And so how do we stop these insider threats? Well, we've all heard security is everyone's job. And we've been to the airports where they say, see something, say something, right? That's true, but I don't think we're very good at our job when it comes to doing those things. When we rely on people to report suspicious behavior, we need to tell them to do that. We shouldn't tell them not to, but it just isn't all that effective. You even see, like, on the news when, the neighbor gets caught, they always say, oh, I thought he was suspicious, or I always thought something weird was going on, but nobody really reports stuff in a lot of these cases. Or in the case of all these famous spies, they're always like, yeah, I thought he was suspicious, or I saw him like maybe acting strangely under his desk or moving lots of papers. But what happens is these people feel bad about casting doubt on their friends or potentially costing their friends their job. And so they don't say anything. They get nervous. They don't want to be confrontational. It's human nature, especially in the US. We're all kind of collegial and team players. And so it ends up not being very effective. So we have to take different approaches. So we need to take a holistic approach. We need to train our employees. We want to deter people that are in our organization from becoming insider threats. We want to detect them, and then we want to respond to those threats. And so from a training perspective, we need to teach everyone basic cybersecurity hygiene, changing passwords, only using your accounts, don't share your password, all those basic things. We need to have an insider threat awareness program to understand and educate people about famous insider threats. What has happened, what damage can happen, why they need to be aware and what they need to do. And then we need to also make people aware of the value of the data that they're working with. They need to understand what is the sensitive data, what's not the sensitive data, how to handle that sensitive data, why is that data sensitive. A lot of people don't realize how sensitive and valuable that data is because they work with it every day. They're kind of numb to it. They don't realize that, hey, this data is very valuable to another foreign government or to our adversary, and that it could save them money because they wouldn't have to spend all the money we did on research and all that stuff. And then make them aware of, what other systems you have access to, partner data that's being shared with you or other systems you're accessing. And then give them guidelines and the rules of the road for how they're expected to safeguard that information and data. Deterrence is an important part of insider threat program. You want to let it be known that you have a program and that you have safeguards, controls, protection, and monitoring, that you are monitoring everybody. You are looking at what's happening. You are investigating. And you want to provide some details, but not all the details. Part of operational security is not telling them where all the cameras and trip points and security sensors are. You want to let them know they're there, but not expose where they are. And you want to make it the hardest alternative. You want to make those people not try to steal the data and realize that their chances of doing it and not getting caught are low, that if they want to do damage, they should look to some other place, not here, because they're going to get caught and it's not an easy way to get the data. And when possible, you want to perform background checks. Obviously, if you have a security clearance, you've had a background check performed by the government. But there's a lot of people that are accessing sensitive, unclassified data, and that information is valuable to a lot of people. So when it's possible, you want to provide background checks, and you want to do it on a regular basis. You want to make sure they're of good standing, they have good character. They didn't all of a sudden come into a situation where they're in debt or their family member needs serious medical treatment and they're feeling desperate and they need money. So you also want to provide them access to get counseling and therapy and help. And then you want to ask them questions. When you see things that are suspicious, you need to confront them and ask questions and not just brush it aside. And so when it comes to detection, obviously trying to detect the insider threat is difficult. So you want to make the problem easier. You want to make the haystack smaller so that it's easier to find the needle. And to do that, you want to segment your data. So you want to make sure you don't treat all data equally. You want to make sure the most sensitive data gets the most scrutiny and the most oversight and watch. And you want to tag that data. So you want to know and classify what data is sensitive, what data has PII, where is the data we need to monitor and protect the most. And then you want to create specialized admin accounts. You do not want your admins using their admin account for everyday user activity. They should use a user account that's not privileged to do their normal functions. They should only escalate or log into their admin account when they have to perform admin functions. That way you can easily scrutinize admin activity and look at the differences between when admins are doing stuff and when users are doing stuff, because it'll become important to be able to see when an admin account starts to do user type activities. That'll be a big important anomaly. And then you want to continuously review permissions and access controls. You constantly want to make sure your team, the data owners, and the project managers are reviewing who has access to that data. And this is something that I don't think we do very well. People are pretty good about disabling accounts and removing access when a person completely leaves a company or an organization. But when they're in a large organization, they move from like group to group or project to project. We often don't remove access to the old project. Sometimes we think, oh, they might help us in the future, or it's not part of the process to review that at a time when they're moving projects, because they didn't change positions, they just moved projects. So you need to make that part of the process and the function, because what happens is as people have a long career in an organization, they have access to almost everything. And now if their account becomes hijacked, it's hard to detect when there's something suspicious going on. And if some hacker outside entity goes from being an outsider and makes himself look like an insider by hijacking that account, it's hard to detect that anomalous behavior, and they have access to a lot of information. And of course, you want to prohibit and eliminate shared accounts. If you have shared accounts, it's horrible, because you don't tie users' activity to a single individual. You have a shared account that if anybody gets access to it, they have access to that, and you can't prosecute the offender because you don't know if it was them that was it or somebody else. Also, if a hacker gets in and starts impersonating someone, it's easy because you don't know if it was one of 100 people. So you need to immediately eliminate all shared accounts. And then you can also implement honeypot files. They act as tripwires. If nobody should access those files, as soon as somebody or someone accesses those files, you can start to investigate who it was and then start to monitor what they're doing and see what else they're trying to do, to then scrutinize their activity and take the next steps. Restricting the movement of data is also another way to protect your data from being leaked or exploited or exfiltrated. So some of the ways you might do this would be saying, I'm going to use virtual desktops and I'm going to keep the data in the data center. So you can, remote into it through a virtual desktop and see all the data and work on it in the data center, but you can't copy the files to your local device. You can't copy and paste to it. You can't download documents. It all stays within the data center. Just like in a facility, you might not allow people to move physical papers and take them home. It's the same concept from a digital perspective. You also want to watermark or tag the data uniquely for the person you shared it with. This allows you to have data provenance and see the source of the data if it later becomes leaked. So for instance, the movie industry does this where they have screening videos. If they share that with somebody, within the academy, they mark it with the person it was shared with. So then if it shows up on the internet as a pirated video, you know exactly which copy it was and who that was shared with, and you have the source and the provenance of that data. You can do the same thing with documents in your environment as well. And then you might want to eliminate remote access to specific folders. So for instance, let's say I'm on a project A. So normally I can access that data. In COVID times now, especially, we all are doing a lot more work from home. So I might have access to that folder as a user, but I might not be able to access that folder when I'm coming in through the VPN. Maybe I'm only allowed to access it when I'm in the facility. So you can segment it and limit when you can access specific files and folders and from where. And then you, of course, want to make sure you have a very strong change control process. This is important, and you want to be able to tie those admin activities to approved change controls, right? Because admins are definitely a weak spot. Admins have a lot of control. They can do a lot of things. So if they're able to make changes to permissions temporarily and it's not scrutinized, they could gain access to data you don't want them to have access to. So you want to make sure you're scrutinizing their activity closely, that they're using a specific admin account and only escalating privileges when they're doing those approved controls. And you also may want two-person control. And one way to do that would be having two admins do these things. So you have an approved change, you have one admin performing the change, and a second admin reviewing those changes to make sure they're not doing anything they shouldn't be doing and that everything's copacetic. And so one thing that's lacking in a lot of environments is the detail of the interaction of users and applications with data. This needs to be grown significantly. We need more detail about what users are doing with the data. The data is your most valuable asset, and we need to focus on the data. A lot of cybersecurity has been focused on the network in the past, but that's not sufficient. You really need to focus on who's accessing what data, what applications are accessing what data, from where and when. And so you want to have the details about what users are there, when do they access the data, how do they access it, how frequently, how much in volume, what users are part of what group, what do those groups do, what are the data sets they're typically interacting with, and then what applications interact with that data from what systems, what part of the network or what IP addresses do they come from, and then what normal times of days does that happen? When does the backup job run? When do people log in and when are their profiles accessed? That creates a pattern of life. And then once you baseline those normal behavior patterns, it becomes much easier to detect abnormal behavior patterns and then quickly spot outlier behavior, outlier interactions, which are typically the malicious and suspicious behavior that you want to find from an insider threat perspective. And we can take all that information about the interaction with the data and fuse that information to create a bigger picture. So you want to have centralized logging of all of your security sensors, of all of your systems. And by fusing that behavior, we can get a better picture of what's happening both in the physical and the virtual world. So for instance, if somebody is logging, is accessing file shares, and we look at this and it says, hey, it says they're accessing it from their desktop, but they didn't go through the access control system, the front door, and come in today. Well, that might be an issue. So we can then go look at their desktop and see what's happening. Are they logged in? Or has some application hijacked or malware hijacked that desktop and started to do that? So by fusing all this information together, we can have a complete picture and better visibility to detect something like an insider threat or any threat for that matter. The other thing you want to do is conduct random investigations and confirmation. Knowing that people might randomly be requested to defend their actions is a good deterrent, and it also helps you detect and understand, are the current rules and controls we have in place effective? So you want to make sure you're spot checking and doing spot audits, just like a random audit investigation, just like you get random searches when you go through the metal detector at the airport. There is value in doing that. As well as you want to investigate abnormal behavior with prejudice. As I mentioned, we're kind of hesitant to confront our colleagues and friends. We don't want to cast doubt on them, but when we see something suspicious, we really got to make sure that they have a real justified and valid reason to be doing that and understand why they did that. And to do that, that means usually it's not just a security person or IT security person, but the data owner or the project manager or their manager, or all of those people get involved to understand and review what happened, and that everybody feels comfortable that what the user did was valid, it wasn't malicious, and it was something in positive pursuit of the goals of the organization. Because all too often it could be kind of blown off or cast aside. You don't want to do that. You want to make sure you fully understand why they did that and that it was a valid reason for doing what they did. And another way to eliminate the emotion, because that is really the problem when it comes to detecting things like insider threat, is automate the response. Computers have no emotion. They're going to look at the analytics, they're going to follow the algorithm, and they're going to respond. And to do that, you can implement a SIM or SOAR or our product to respond without emotion. You can stop access in real time, right? So if you see all of a sudden a ton of data is being read or copied, you might not want to wait until somebody can investigate that in the SOC. You may want to stop access immediately. If they really have a valid reason for copying that data or moving that data, they'll be able to respond. They'll call the help desk and say, hey, my access got stopped. And then the help desk person can review it and say, okay, yeah, I'll turn it back on. But if it was a hacker that hijacked an account, they're not going to call and do that. Also, you want to have enough information to prosecute them. So if you do determine that, hey, somebody did do stuff malicious, you need enough detail, enough controls in place to show that they violated the rules, they did things they shouldn't have, and here's the evidence that's forensically correct to present in court. And then you want to make sure you can trigger other investigative steps too. So for instance, like I mentioned, if all of a sudden you see suspicious behavior coming from a desktop, you might enable that desktop to start recording what's happening on the screen and then review the user's interaction and have a SOC operator monitor them in real time. So there's all sorts of things you could do based on suspicious or malicious behavior. And you want to then get the managers and the project or data owners involved so they can understand and have knowledge of why that data is being used and is that acceptable use of the data. So you're probably wondering, now how do I implement something like this in my environment? And really what it comes down to is implementing a zero trust architecture. And a zero trust architecture isn't something you buy, it's a way of thinking and it's an approach to thinking about security. So zero trust is something that's been around for about 10 years, and it's a concept with end-to-end security where instead of trust but verify, we verify every action, we trust nothing. And we're protecting data at the core. If you think back 20 years ago, we used to assume, hey, once you showed up, you were inside the perimeter, you were trusted, it was safe. We now know that's not true, right? We have evidence, we have insider threats. People like Snowden, they will try to steal the data. So if you give them access to everything, they can take it. We can't trust anything. We have to verify and validate every user's interaction and activity. And we continuously want to review people's permissions and access controls. We may dynamically change that based on the threat situation. If somebody does a bunch of things, we may eliminate their access or change how we give them access to data, or maybe the environment has changed where they're now out of the country. We want to cut off access till they return. So it's a completely dynamic and different approach to security from the way we were 20 years ago. And we want to audit everything that's happening in the system. And we want to ensure data integrity. We want to make sure that the data hasn't been manipulated in any way. We wouldn't want, for instance, in a hospital, for your medical records to be manipulated so that you received the wrong treatment or got the wrong blood type. So you need to make sure that the data provenance is there and that the data is 100% intact all the time. And so we have founded Racktop and built the Brickstore security platform to make it easy to implement a data-centric zero trust architecture to detect things like insider threats, but also to defend against malware and traditional cyber attacks. And we deliver it through a software-defined network-attached storage solution. And we enable you to store and protect your unstructured data in a way that makes it easy to manage your unstructured data, to make it accessible to your users, to manage permissions and access controls, as well as review and audit what's happening with the system all the time. And built into Brickstore SP is an active defense capability. And so I'll get into a little bit more detail about this in the next slide. And so the key features are, it's as I mentioned, a true software-defined NAS. So we support the latest file protocols, both SMB and NFS, up to SMB 3.11 and NFS 4.2 and the lower versions. And we support encryption from the client to the storage itself. So the communications of data in motion between the client and the storage is all encrypted and protected. It doesn't require any special software on the client. And then once it gets to the storage, we can be space and storage efficient and compress and deduplicate the data before we encrypt it again for data at rest. And we can actually encrypt it twice. We can encrypt it at a volume level and we can encrypt it at a drive level. So you have multiple levels of protection and encryption. And then we have policy-based snapshots to protect the data. So you can quickly recover a version of a file to a previous version, and users can restore files to previous versions on their own, or admins can restore files for them for a user as well. And what's key about our solution is you can allow admins to restore files without seeing the contents of the file. So they would never have access to sensitive content in the course of their duties. And everything they do as an admin, all of that is tied to a change controller ticket. All that's audited as well. And so part of our active defense capability, which allows us to detect and stop malware, ransomware, and insider threats, ties all of these capabilities of user behavior and auditing of admin activity so that we can stop a threat in real time. So we can actually stop something like a ransomware attack, disable the user IP, disable the user ID so that they can't continue to access data, and report this to a SIM or to a SOC so that they can take action to maybe disable or isolate that offending desktop from the network. So there's a lot of capabilities that are built into the product, and it's done in a way that it doesn't sacrifice the user experience or application performance. We're doing all of these security and compliance capabilities in line as you're writing and reading to the system, and we use RAM so that we can do this by in real time and eliminate any latency. Because a lot of times people think about security and they think they're going to have to sacrifice performance. Once you turn the security on, they're afraid that the performance is going to go down. That's not the case with Brickstore SP. And so just a little bit more detail on the user behavior auditing analysis. It can quickly allow you to identify outlier behavior. So we're giving you lots of detail about what's happening on an individual file basis. So we can show you, each user, we're capturing their user ID, the IP they came from, the file operation type, whether they read a file, moved a file, renamed a file, wrote a file, modified it, how big that operation was, did they read the whole file? And we can sort that by time of day. You can filter down to the user to see if you're suspicious of a particular user. You can export all the activity that that particular user took. You can see what happened just after hours. And this is not only useful from a security and insider threat perspective, but just an operational perspective to see if somebody said, hey, I can't find this folder, you could quickly search for that folder and say, oh yeah, looks like somebody dragged and dropped it and moved from here to there. And you can attribute to that person. Or if all of a sudden somebody modified files, you can see who modified those files. So it gives you visibility into your infrastructure like no other tool. And if you're wondering, like, has anyone touched this data in a long period, you can report on that too. Maybe you have a ton of data that's stale. You could get rid of that because it's a liability if it's exposed that a hacker could get access to if nobody's using it. So you can see when was the last time any data was accessed. You can also have conversations with users. Maybe you're not sure who uses this folder. It's been around for a long time. You can see who the people are that use it, assign a data owner, and then have conversations about who should have access to that data so that you can tighten down your attack surface. And all this information can be fed in real time to a SIM or SOAR like Splunk or Elk or any other tool that you use. It's all in a standard RFC 5424 syslog format. And we have flexible deployment options. So you can deploy it as a turnkey appliance, a traditional NAS with direct attached disk, but we can also front your existing storage capacity. So if you have existing storage and you have enough capacity, we can provide secure NAS capabilities on top of that. And so you don't have to rip and replace. You can, sit on top of your existing capacity, or you can deploy as a virtual machine on your existing infrastructure or in the cloud. We work with all the popular hypervisors. You can even deploy it within your hyperconverged environment, like on Nutanix. So it's very flexible. We even have a Jumpstart program, which allows you to deploy a virtual machine in your environment with full support for 90 days for free to test out the full capabilities of Brickstore SP and see how it would work in your environment with your own data. And so the 3 secrets to thwarting the insider threat is, 1, we want to try to deter them. If we don't have to deal with them, they go someplace else, that's the best. We want to implement a zero trust architecture so we understand completely what's happening within our environment. We're verifying and validating every user's interaction with our data infrastructure. And then we want to simplify the detection of anomalous behavior by segmenting data, understanding where our data is, tagging it, and who is accessing the data from where, so that we can determine a normal baseline for behavior and then an anomalous behavior pattern. I hope that you found this information useful. We are more than happy to give you a demo of Brickstore SP so you can see more about the features and capabilities of how it works and how we can help you detect and stop insider threats. Feel free to email us at info@racktopsystems.com to set up a demo, or you can sign up for the free Jumpstart program by going to our website, racktopsystems.com/jumpstart, and sign up for the free 90-day Jumpstart program. I appreciate your time and look forward to speaking with you in the future. Thank you.